Hello, my name is Susan Addelston. I am a retired New York City public high school social studies teacher. I spent my last several decades doing educational talks and speaking engagements for a variety of organizations. Today, I have the joy and the honor of speaking at the East Brunswick Historical Society in a beautifully restored farmhouse. My topic were the First Ladies, the secret lives of First Ladies of the United States. We had 42 of them, and in 2 hours, believe it or not, I went from Martha to Mary to Melania to Michelle and today. This is great fun for me. I enjoy this enormously. I have a whole variety of topics, almost 60 separate things I can talk about. I'd be happy to be engaged by any educational or fun organization. This is just a joy. I hope that you all read. I hope that you all register to vote, and that you all have newspapers by subscriptions coming into your home and have a library card and use it well. Thank you very much. Always wonderful. I appreciate always being invited back to things. Unfortunately, the COVID plague interfered. I think otherwise I would have been back earlier, but I'm always grateful you gave up a gorgeous fall Sunday afternoon to be here. Not so much a lecturer as a discussion leader, educator, educational, whatever the thing is. And yeah, I plead guilty to being a high school history teacher. Sorry about that. But have done a lot of other things. And when I retired from the 9 to 5. I'm never going to go back to the classroom. Can't do that anymore. But I still felt that I had things I wanted to do. And so I did college and private school and all kinds of other things. And then I just fell into, literally, it just happened that groups started to say, do you know anything about? And I said, yeah, I know a little bit. And it started from there. I had no plans, no career coach guidance or anything. It just happenstance. And so I now have a list of about almost 60 different topics that I can talk on, and this one is particularly close to my heart. Normally I do this like in March because it's Women's History Month, but it can be done, it's a universal, it can be done at almost any time. Very low tech. Feel free to ask questions, comments, that we bring a rich background to all of this. Much of this, when we get up more in our age range, you'll kind of remember a little bit. I always used to tell my kids that I lived through this, and that's how I knew so much about it. So I'm going to pass around just two things that I think you would like to look at. And yes, I did steal this from a magazine in a doctor's office. This is a photograph of the dedication of the Nixon Library, Reagan Library, and you'll see it's an extraordinary photograph. I can't imagine why this isn't in more places, because it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 first ladies, which is unheard of. And part of the reason is because they're alive, because first ladies didn't used to live at that length. So here's a small version. I'm going to pass it on this side. You can get this side, and that will give you sort of an idea about it. Yeah. I'm sorry?
Who's the one in blue?
In blue on the bottom?
Yes.
Okay, so let me put... So if you look at it from left to right, you'll see Lady Bird Johnson.
Yes.
You'll see Pat Nixon in that dark bluish purple. Behind her in Nancy Reagan red is Nancy Reagan.
Yes.
On her right is Barbara Bush with the triple strand of pearls, because, as I'll tell you later on, she had a childhood accident and she felt that her neck was scarred. It wasn't. Maybe George saw it, but nobody else in the world saw it. So she always, no matter what outfit she had on, a triple strand of pearls to hide something. And then you'll see Rosalind Carter, who was still alive at age 97, and then Betty Ford. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, it's just an extraordinary poster.
Right now.
Yeah, the Reagan Library. So when we talk about first ladies, the name itself is just an artificial construct. The Constitution, as you are aware, says nothing about them. It says very little about women in general, if anything, but clearly not first ladies. The concept of it grew up organically as each first lady made their mark on whatever they were doing. And of course, among the interesting things about them is that since the role was undefined, every first lady could do whatever she wanted to do. Some did nothing, some did terrific things. And we demanded, as again the country grew older and aged, we demanded or suggested different sorts of things from them. Remember that we're going back to 1789 when the first president was elected, George Washington, and that was Martha. And the role had not been defined because there was no such role. So whatever each first lady sort of did kind of set a pattern in some ways for those that came after her. Again, some good, some bad. And the expectations of the nation changed as well. What role were women first expected to play? Mothers, wives. That's what a woman could do, right? There were hardly any professions, although, as you know, from early on, women did have professions. They were all different kinds of things. They just were never recognized for it. It wasn't written into the history books, but they did earn money. They did have it. So here we have a woman who is the ultimate female in the land, if that's what you want to call about it. And as with George Washington, what do we call her? Well, John Adams said maybe call them His Excellency because that was John Adams. He was an Anglophile. Sire, Your Highness, because that's all they knew. We were the first nation in the world not to have a government of religious theocracy that ruled us, or military where everybody saluted, or a divine right of kings where if you didn't agree, I burned you at the stake or took your head off or something like that. We were a civilian government, and that cannot be stressed strongly enough. We had no templates. Washington and everybody else did not look up Google and say, how do we run the government? It didn't exist. So they're making things up. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending, we are the inheritors of what they invented or did out of the genius that they were. And I firmly believe that they were, in fact, geniuses. As you understand, the 55 men that met in Philadelphia, just down the road in Independence Hall, had read widely. They all knew each other. You could have fit 50, maybe not in this room, but you could have fit 55 people, certainly in this building. They all knew each other. They were, most of them, professionals. They were relatively wealthy or well off. There were a couple of ministers that were poor, typically. There were no teachers, there were no women, but they were merchants, they were farmers, they were tradespeople. They were rich. John Hancock, typical American. And how did he make his money? He was a smuggler, right? That was an American. So you had all these different cross currents there. And when they met and they wrote the Constitution, Abigail, in one of her famous letters to John, said, I would ask you to please remember the ladies. And she goes on about how wonderful they are and how they're done. And Abigail was one of the women that helped win the American Revolution. How? She not invented, she read up on, she mastered, how do you make gunpowder? And she did it. Abigail Adams made gunpowder for the American Revolution. It's not in the history books, but she figured out how to do it. And the ladies of Braintree and Quincy, Massachusetts, in addition to knitting and churning and raising kids, they made gunpowder. I mean, it's an extraordinarily unknown sort of event and background. You'll never find it in the history books unless you do a lot of research. But this is part of what they did. They had sewing circles, they made uniforms, they made shoes, they did whatever they could to help. And making gunpowder, what? I mean, yeah, that's what they did. So part of the role of First Lady was kind of subsumed or interwoven with that. And as part of it, the public perception of the First Lady, in some ways, changed public perception of what is the role of a woman? What can a woman do? What can a woman not do? And that was part of the interesting thing as it grew up. Other nations don't have anything like this. Well, for starters, if they were monarchs, they had queens, which was a totally different thing. And military never had a woman as a fix, except in Argentina where you had Evita Peron, but that was a whole different story. And theocracies obviously never would have a woman there. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist and that they didn't have influence, just that they have been, as so typical of women throughout history, have been written out. Yes, you can find them if you delve into it and you can have it. And so what happens if we finally get, at some point in our lifetimes, maybe a woman president? Then we'll maybe have a first gentleman, right? Who is the current vice president of the United States? And she has a husband. And what is his name?
Doug.
Doug?
Imhoff.
Yes, Imhoff. Two totally different last names. Unheard of. She's using the name she was born. That alone is an extraordinary event, that it has come to where a woman is identified, a very public woman is identified by the name she was born with, whether it was her husband's father's name or not, and he's not identified with her so much as the reverse. So he is now called, if you read any articles about her, he's the second gentleman, which is an invented title, right, which doesn't really exist, but it's a weird sort of thing that happens. And it's fascinating to realize how they have been treated throughout history. Number question. President of the United States today is?
46.
Correct. What number is he?
46.
Excellent. 5 points on your final. Wonderful. How many, 46 presidents, right? We all agree, right? 46 presidents. How many first ladies have we had? Trick question. You don't know the answer, but I'll tell you.
45.
44.
42.
42.
42. Because we had one president, Buchanan, thank heavens, who had
He was a bachelor.
bachelor, never had it just as well because he was a terrible president. We had other presidents whose wives had died prior to, and I'll talk about them, or wives who died in. And we had a president, thank you, Woodrow Wilson, who had two wives while he was there. So there's this, right, so yes, not at the same time, hopefully. But so we only have 42. And the interesting thing is, we know, or at least very recently, at least since World War II, what has happened, what happens to a president after they leave the White House? They don't just sink into the ground. They get officially recognized. There is a congressional post-presidential act which provides for a presidential pension, right? Never used to exist, but it's a job, so they get a pension. Office space, medical care, travel, Secret Service protection, all this other kind of good stuff. So maybe an ex-president costs us somewhere between, and the numbers vary, so don't hold me to this, somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 a year, okay? Somewhere in that, whatever it is, whatever you want to think it is, that's what it is, right? How much does a president's widow get? Until Mamie Eisenhower, absolutely nothing. You are absolutely correct. There was zero provision made for the widows of presidents because a woman would be taken care of by her family, right? She was not supposed to be a public charge. So when when Dwight Eisenhower died, the nation recognized that Mamie, even with his military pension, 5-star general, right, from West Point and everything else, did not have an amount sufficient to live. And the first house they actually owned was they bought a farm, you know that, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Up until this time, she'd moved every 2 or 3 years through her life. Okay, so Mamie Eisenhower, everybody loves little Mamie, you know that, with the bangs and the pink bows and everything, right? So how much did Congress, in its awesome generosity for her service, how much was her pension a year? Remember, it's the 1950s. Close, $20,000. $20,000. No medical, no office, no protection, no nothing. And from that, she was expected to maintain. And now,
Was the president at that time?
President
At that time.
he probably about $250,000 along with everything else.
The current president now makes 400,000.
Oh,
It wasn't too long ago that the current
President was making,
400,000.
exactly.
Former president is not making.
But that has not changed. Whatever the number that Congress fixed, that was it. I don't know that it's added on to inflation or everything. Maybe it has. But a group of wealthy Republican donors saw that she obviously was not destitute. She didn't go out and beg, that they kept her in the estate, the style in which she had been accustomed to as a general's widow. So that happened. So the pay inequality is stunning even at that level. And you certainly know today that a woman who works makes somewhere around 80 cents, 82 cents for every dollar that a man makes. So that is part of what we're talking about. Now, we talk about first ladies. Clearly, we start with Martha Washington. I'm not going to do all 42, although I think most of their stories are fascinating. I picked out maybe the first 10, although you can ask me about the others. I have. So, Martha Washington, she was married at age 19 to typical teenage bride to a 40-year-old man. Their marriage lasted until he died. She was widowed at 26. So, age 19 to 7 years marriage, she had 4 children in 7 years. 2 of the children died, which was typical of infant mortality at the time. But he left her one of the richest women in the colonies. She had an estate of over 17,000 acres. 17,000 acres in colonial Virginia. And she had well over 300 slaves. She was rich, beyond what we can possibly imagine now. How did she meet George? George was the younger son of a neighboring plantation, and they all knew each other. And so here's this rich widow, 26 years old, 5 foot tall, and George is maybe 6'1" or let's say 6'1", depending, okay? And he starts courting her. He doesn't have many prospects of his own. He is a surveyor by trade. That's his profession. Never went to college, but they fall in love. They meet at a ball. They dance. Within 6 months, they are engaged. They get married. And George's wedding present to her, right? His wedding present to her was a cradle. Does anyone remember, as I do, the old wooden cradles that used to sit on the floor? Remember that? I had one, right from my dolls. But I had one like that. On their wedding night, true story, he hands her a wooden cradle, and he puts it on the floor, and he says, "Madam, I expect you to keep this filled." How about that? Which, of course, never happened. They never had children together. It wasn't her fault. She had 4 before she married him. He was sterile. Why? Because as a teenager, he had gone to visit Brother Lawrence in the West Indies. He had a sugar plantation. That's where the family, among other things, the family wealth came from. And he probably caught, medical diagnosis 240 some years ago, either smallpox or mumps. What happens to males when they catch those? They become sterile. He survived. How do we think it was smallpox? Because his face had marks on it, although that could have been from almost anything, but he was sterile. And therefore, they never had children. And historians say, yes, that is a good thing. Why? Because, I'm so glad you asked, if George and Martha had had children, there would have been a possibility of people saying, let's make the presidency hereditary. Let's give it, because everybody loved George, almost everybody loved George. Let's make it that because the general and he won the revolution and all these other kind of great things, but they never had children. And from an historical point of view, yes, that's wonderful, because then it eliminated the whole possibility that the presidency would be passed down by inheritance, that the elections, which are built into the Constitution, would take place. Does that sound bizarre to you? But it was true at the time, because that's all people knew, hereditary, right? Monarchies. And that was part of the deal. So her children did not turn out terribly well. He sort of adopted them. There wasn't any formal adoption procedure. That's a whole different thing. But she ran a very impressive plantation. She was a very smart woman. And the pattern that she set for First Lady was one of being social. And again, it was patterned on the European royalty. She held balls and levees, they were called. I probably don't pronounce that in French. There's an accent on it, whatever it is. And people would come and they would dance and hello and how are you? And they would throw dinners and parties and things of that sort. George hated it. But he understood that this was part of the public role. And she liked it because it was one of the few times that women could be in public, right, and talk and be nice to people, and she loved it. Another fascinating thing, remember I said she was 5 feet and he was 6 something? So she complained to him, nobody can see me, George, I'm too short. When we have these dinners and events, I want a built-up dais, the way everybody has, so we can sit in these fancy chairs, right? And people can come up and shake my hand and kiss me on the cheek, and they will bow to me. That's what Martha said. And they will recognize me. And it doesn't make a difference to you. You're tall. You can kind of walk around and do this. And George, to his credit, said, no, this is not going to happen. And that's another pattern that she set, that she was an ordinary civilian citizen woman, and she didn't sit high. I mean, you have to imagine, this is 1789, 90. The thrones, the church people sitting high up, the military. So had that pattern been established, the separation between us and them would have kind of been fixed maybe, but it didn't, because George was very cognizant of his role in life. When he was fighting in the American Revolution, he was General Washington. As soon as the revolution was won, he deliberately resigned his commission. When he went into thing, he took off his sash of office and his sword. He laid it on the table. He was then plain Mr. Washington, Citizen Washington. So she had to kind of adapt to that as part of it. It's the end of George's life. He's only in his 60s. It's raining at Mount Vernon, a cold winter rain. He goes out riding to check on the slaves in the field. He catches pneumonia. The treatment, medical people in those days, you cut open veins and you bled the evil humor out. And so for several days, he was bled. An old man, no nourishment, infection, he dies. It is 1799. Did he know he was dying? Yes, he did. Everybody knew he was dying. He says to Martha, and he writes in his will, because they were rich people, they had wills, they knew about doing this. He says, when I die, please make sure you free my slaves. All right, nice thing to do on your deathbed because you don't need them anymore, but he certainly didn't do it when he was alive. And here's where Martha's story becomes what? What does one say? Martha knew what his wishes were. And upon his death, she did 2 terrible things that historians have never forgiven her for. One, she did not free the slaves, his or hers. She dies in 1804. She never freed them. As a matter of fact, to pay debts, and they all were in debt, they had no sense of money management, she sells some of them, breaks apart families, things of that sort. And then she does something that we will never, ever forgive her for. She burns his papers. Hundreds and hundreds of documents. Inconceivable. All that he had written from the battlefield, from his contacts with everyone who mattered, from his early times on, and he kept extensive journals. He was a well-educated man. Burned. We have letters from him to other people, but she was the one he wrote to almost every single day of his life. And they're gone. Totally gone.
Why do you think she did that?
She didn't want to share them with the world. She felt they were private. She felt they were intimate. She didn't grasp the historical significance. How does one get into the mind of a woman 200 plus years ago? She knew how important he was. Every single day, people would come to Mount Vernon. They were never alone. And people from abroad. Lafayette brought the whole French court. Polish people, German people, everybody that he had in contact with, he burned them all. That's it. So think what you will of Martha, but historians don't like her. She was, in fact, the first woman to be put on a U.S. postage stamp. Not so sure I would have done that. In any case, That's what it is. So Martha Washington. Martha Washington.
She was married.
Never. She died a few years after he did. I think 1803, 1804. And her kids never turned out well. They were always in trouble with the law. They were in debt. They never achieved anything. But they were her kids, not his kids, not their kids, together. Terrible. So that's Martha Washington. And the paradigm that she set has sort of carried through on. The second First Lady was Abigail Adams. Everyone adores Abigail. She could have been elected in her own right. She was the son of a minister. She never formally went to school because even ministers' girls didn't do that. But her father had an extensive library and she read all through it. And because it was Massachusetts, she read through others' libraries. So she was very well educated. At 15 years old, she meets John, who is exactly 10 years older than she is. He's 25, she's 15. The story is, he walks into the house to have a meeting with her minister father, and she comes in reading a book to return it on the shelf, and he looks at her and she looks at him, and that's it. Love at first sight. But the father said, she's only 15. You can't marry her, right? So they waited until she was 18. That's age of majority. And then she got married in her father's parlor, and he performed the ceremony. And it's one of the great love stories of the universe. They were apart for decades, too many years, because he was ambassador to France and to England and Russia, and he was traveling and he was at the convention and everything else. So she was left to run the business, which she did. The fact that she had no formal education was irrelevant. She was an extremely smart and brilliant woman. They had 5 children. She may have had another miscarriage somewhere in there, one of whom died. Again, we're going to be talking about deaths of children a lot at this point. And she ran everything. And they wrote. Oh, who did they write? If you go to the National Archives, you will find rooms full, walls, ceilings of their correspondence, because Abigail saved everything. We love her. Of course, John did the same thing. They started their letters, "Dear Friend," and they signed it, "Your most affectionate," either husband or wife, depending on who was writing to whom. And they talked about everything. The price of corn, that Johnny was sick, that Tommy needed a pair of shoes, and then what the Russian ambassador said and what the British, and it's amazing. It is a fabulous, fabulous treasure trove. I once sat down and I started to read some of it, not all of it, because I'm not that kind of a scholar, but it's just amazing. They talk about ordinary farm things, and the next thing, and the Russian ambassador said, and it just goes on and on and on. And Abigail was the first of the first ladies to actually live in the White House. Washington, as you know, our first capital was originally Philadelphia for a very brief time. We'll forget about that. And then it moved to New York City, and that's where they lived and entertained and everything. But George and Martha both hated New York City. A, it was a free city, so they worried about their slaves. And B, it was busy, noisy, terrible. They were farm people, so they hated it. What happened, D.C., District of Columbia, was 10 miles given by Virginia and Maryland to create a new city. Thank you, Alexander Hamilton. And the deal was that each state would give that, and that's where the new city was built. And Washington died, and so it was named for him. And it's not a state, it's a district, a special legal artificial construct called of Columbia, because Columbus discovered it. And we're naming it for him. And so John Adams and Abigail were the first to live there. And obviously the president needs a place to live. It's a swamp, literally, at that time. And so they built a house of stone. And it was Virginia sandstone, which is sort of a beigey, pinky type color. And it was one of the only residences in the entire district that was built of stone. Everything else is built of wood. Shift a little bit parenthetically, it's the War of 1812. The British come in, they can't conquer Fort McHenry. That's the Star-Spangled Banner story. They do conquer Washington. They come in. Abigail Adams rolls up the bigger-than-life-size picture. Gilbert Stuart, the painter of the Revolution, who painted the triumphant pictures of Washington, cuts it out of its frame, rolls it up, tucks it under her arm, and runs away. That's the only reason we have any of these artworks there because Abigail, among other things, saved it. So she's living in this house. There's nothing in it. It's empty, totally empty. She hangs, it's the typical story. She hangs her laundry in the west wing because that's the one, the east room, because that's the one that gets the sun to dry it. They loved each other very much. They enjoyed each other. Abigail entertained. Everyone adored her. She could make friends out of anyone. She was a wonderful human being. And poor John did not have her social graces. He was a one-term president, the first one. And at the election of 1800, when he understands that Jefferson has won, he throws a hissy fit. I am not going to stay for the inauguration. They leave at midnight the day before. Abigail is in tears. She wanted, the party to meet everything, crying, but they go back to Massachusetts, and that's where they live out the rest of their lives. At that point, one would have assumed Abigail fades into history, right? Not Abigail. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson have become bitter enemies. They were in the first cabinet that Washington provided, right? Hamilton is Secretary of Treasury, Jefferson is Secretary of State. And while they were united like this during the Revolution and the early Constitution thing, they become political enemies. Federalists, anti-Federalists. Jefferson is going to found the Democratic, capital D, hyphen, capital R, Republican Party. Drop the Republican, it'll become the Democratic Party. So they are bitter enemies because of a whole variety of things, and they don't talk to each other. Abigail can't stand any of this. She doesn't like the whole idea. She finds out that one of Jefferson's granddaughters has died. Again, typical, very young girl. And as a grandmother and mother, she writes, "Dear Thomas," because that's how she knows him. And she writes to Dear Thomas, "I am so sorry for your loss. We also lost one of ours. Anything we can do, the life," and she goes on and on. This wonderful, warm, charming thing. And remember, she's a woman. Thomas Jefferson in Virginia gets the letter. "Oh, Abby wrote to me. I guess I can write back to her. Not John, but I'll write to Abby." So he writes to Abby, and Abby quietly slips in a couple of things from John. And over the course of the next several decades, almost 30 decades, the two men start writing to each other again. John writes a lot more than Thomas Jefferson does, but they both write. And Abigail quietly fades into the background. But it was her initiative that started this correspondence. And why is this so critically important? Because historians love her. Because this contact between the two of them talked about the founding of the early republic, the concepts, what they thought, whom they met, what was good, what was bad, what they should have done, what they missed. It's extraordinary. It's just the most amazing thing to read. And of course, that both men died on the same day. In 1826, on July 4th, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence. And John Adams' last words to his beloved Abigail was, "I can die content because Thomas survives me." We have that. We know it. 700 miles away in Virginia. Later in the evening, Thomas Jefferson dies.
I swear.
We don't have his last words. No one thought to write them down. But imagine these two men that had created our nation and then became horrible, really evil, nasty, bitter enemies, brought together by Abigail. And to the end of their lives, they then became friends again. It's just, you can't make this stuff up, right? And what happens to Abigail? She becomes sort of like the matriarchal figure of the nation. Everybody loves her. She lives for another 15 to 20 years. And what does she do? And people donate to her and everything else. And what does she do with the rest of her life? Remember I told you she had no formal education? She was a minister's daughter? She found schools for girls. How about that? And she gets some of her friends, rich friends now, to endow them so that they have books and teachers and buildings. A place for a girl to go to get an education. extraordinary. So everybody loves Abigail. She was just an amazing, amazing person. Um, it would be nice if we had people like her again. The third president, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson married the daughter of a neighboring plantation owner. Her name was Martha, common name in those days, but she was called Patsy. In the 10 years that they were married, she was pregnant 7 times in 10 years. Of the 7 times she was pregnant, only 2 survived. Those 2 were girls, one named after her, one named after a friend. On her deathbed, Patsy Jefferson said to Thomas, "I want you to promise me that you will not remarry." And being Thomas Jefferson, he says, "Okay, Patsy, I will not remarry." Probably a big mistake on his part, because he's still only in his 40s. And as Southern plantation owners did then, he bought his wife's half-sister from the same plantation. His first wife and the slave he bought had the same father, the owner of the plantation, but their mothers. Patsy's mother was white. Sally Hemings' mother was a black slave. But that black slave was also a product of a black-white union. Now, we have no pictures of this at all. We have no idea what she looked like. All we know is that Sally Hemings was the half-sister, same father, 2 different mothers, of Thomas Jefferson's first wife. Is that why he bought her? Did she look like his first wife? Possible. They had the same father, so it is possible. And Sally Hemings moved into Monticello, which is Jefferson's plantation, and she had with him 6 children, all of whom lived. She was perhaps, and again, I say this because I have no documentation that is valid, but historians have generally accepted the fact that he was close to 40, maybe even 41, 42. She was maybe 15 or 16, somewhere around that. Okay? So they had the children, and she lived on the plantation. And she had a room in Monticello, backstairs there. And he took her to Paris with him when he was ambassador to France, allegedly as the, well, literally as the maid of his daughter, one of his daughters who survived. He promised her, again, story, that their children would be free. He lied. He never freed one of them. We think, best as we know, that there were 3 or 4 sons, maybe, and the others were girls. But again, records are a little bit fuzzy on this, so don't hold me to it in any case. The firstborn child was a son, and those young children he took with him to Paris, and he had this young boy trained as a French chef. Jefferson was a Francophile, everything French, French, French. And he promised him that when he completed his training, he would take him back, he'd set him up in his own. Never happened. Kept him on the plantation forever and had him there. Jefferson dies, 1826. Sally Hemings kind of fades into history a little bit. Not really sure. I mean, we know she has outlived him. We know her children and so on and so forth, and we can have all of that. And the legend is then that Thomas Jefferson is the father of the Hemingway children. That doesn't really get proven until, fast forward, DNA, anyone? And some of her descendants with the same last name who have stayed sort of in that area were tested, and there are Jefferson descendants and tested, and you know what? It's a match. So there is no question about this. The only little tiny footnote that I put down on this is that it is remotely possible, believe what you want, that 2 of her children might have been fathered by Jefferson's nephew. Okay? But we know that at least almost all of them were fathered by him. So that's Thomas Jefferson, one of our famous.
I
Yeah.
thought that Thomas Jefferson freed all the slaves in his will.
Yes, in his will. Did that ever happen? They were sold. They were sold to pay off his debts. As his library of 6,000 books was given to Congress, that's the origin of our Library of Congress, because the British had burned it. Yes, he died. He could have lived 100 years and he never would have paid off his debts. Everything was on credit. He was who's going to quarrel with, Thomas Jefferson? He had cellars full of French wine, leather-bound books, imported furniture, all kinds of fancy stuff. Yes, China and everything else. His slaves were never freed, ever, despite what the will said. But by that time, it's 1826, and it is my understanding that Virginia was already at the stage of passing laws that slaves could not be freed unless they volunteered to go back to Africa or move north. So we've already established Liberia under Monroe. I don't know whether or not they had any freedom of choice in the matter. I would seriously doubt it. But yeah, that's exactly what his will said. That's exactly right. So, remember I talked about the White House, the sandstone mansion, the Virginia thing? So we're going back to Dolly Madison. This is the War of 1812. The British are there. They capture Washington. She runs out with Washington's portrait. And the British, because they're angry, evil people, right? They burn the Washington. And a lot of the wooden buildings go up in flames. And the house, it was called the Executive Mansion, that the president and the first lady lived in, got scorched. We don't have money to build a new one. So how do you cover scorch marks? We paint it white. And that's why it's called the White House. It used to be, at least when I toured the White House a couple of times, you could ask one of the guides to take you to an outside corner, and they would show you that they hadn't painted over, it was under glass, a little piece of it so you could see where the scorch marks were. I don't know if that's still possible anymore or if it's still there, but I did a long time ago, because I went to college in Washington, D.C. Little tiny square with scorch marks on it. So it is interesting to have all of that. We all know Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson, Democrat. Born in South Carolina under the Revolution, had a scar on his face. Why? Because when he was a young boy and the British captured his town, the British officer said, "Polish my boots." And Jackson, in his typical Andrew Jackson way, said, "Whatever." And the officer took out his sword and slashed at him. Did not kill him, but scarred his face. So Jackson, among other things, grows up angry, bitter, the scar and everything else. Nonetheless, he moves west. There's nothing in South Carolina for him. His family is very poor. He moves into Tennessee. He needs a place to live. He lives in a tavern. Taverns were like hotels in those days. They rented rooms. And the tavern keeper's owner is this very curvy, lush lady called Rachel. She's married. But she and Jackson look at each other. The legend is on the stairs. Who knows? And they fall in love. And they want to get married. Problem. She's already married, right? So what did they do? They run away. They go to, think of a map of the United States. They cross the Mississippi into Spanish territory. We haven't bought Louisiana yet, right? So they cross into Spanish territory, which is Catholic, and they get a divorce. Why did they get a divorce? Because Rachel was married in a Protestant ceremony, and the Catholics don't recognize that. So from the Catholic point of view, she's not married. So they can get married, and they get married in Spanish, Mississippi, Louisiana, whatever you want to call it. And they come back. And conveniently, her husband's dead. How did that happen? Could Jackson have paid for his? Who knows? Anything is possible. In any case, Jackson and Rachel, again, are one of the major love stories of presidents and their first wives. And their tragedy is that they never have children together, because they would have loved to have had that. But he works his way up. He's a lawyer, a state legislature. He goes to Congress, becomes a general, becomes an Indian fighter, slaughters hundreds of thousands of Indians, adopts an Indian boy who then subsequently dies of tuberculosis. Rachel supports him through all of this. Rachel is an interesting first lady. She smoked. Yes. Cigarettes haven't been invented yet. She smoked a pipe. And because the Spanish ambassador, right, knew them because they had been to Spain, so the Spanish ambassador gives them cigars. Rachel smokes cigars and pipes. Nonetheless, they adore each other. They're there. Jackson finally gets elected president, and Rachel dies. TB, pneumonia. He has her buried in a mausoleum that he built specially at the Hermitage in Tennessee. It's a beautiful building, probably as big as this, maybe more, with grounds and everything around it. And she is buried in the gown that she would have worn at his inauguration should she have survived until then. And when you go to the Hermitage and when you visit it, the first place the guides always take you to, Rachel's tomb. And there's this long, passionate inscription about my beloved and my heart, you know, and everything else. So Jackson is crushed. And maybe that's why he was a mean president, because he didn't have Rachel there to temper him. On the other hand, he did a number of other things, but we'll skip over that. So we have Rachel. Then we have, I'm just going to mention this very quickly. William Henry Harrison, hero, Tippecanoe, and Tyler too, right? The battles. William Henry Harrison married a woman called Anne. In 20 years, they had 10 children. All of them died. That always blew me away. Not one of them lived. 10 children in 20 years. They all died. William Henry Harrison gets elected because he's an Indian fighter, goes to Washington, D.C., speaks at his inauguration outside in a pouring, driven, cold March rain, catches pneumonia, dies in 6 months. Gone. Forget him. That's all you need to know about him. Tyler inherits the presidency, and then he's the, yes, whatever. He's the 30 days, right? And he's gone. So, and Anne Hutchinson never gets to live in Washington because she was going to come, you know, after the inauguration. What's the point? He's dead now, so he lives a long time. It's unfortunate. When we come to, how about this one? Anybody remember? Of course you do. Franklin Pierce? What? Franklin Pierce, president before the Civil War? What is Franklin Pierce's claim to fame? He was an ancestor of Barbara Pierce Bush. Barbara Bush is related to Franklin Pierce, who was a terrible president, but his ancestry line goes down. And one of the Bush's children, first name is Pierce. That's all you have to know about him. You don't have to know anything else. But that was interesting. The one that you were all dying to hear about, almost, I know, Mary Todd Lincoln. Born in Kentucky, rich, another shorty. Women didn't grow very big in those days, 5 feet, right? And she meets Abraham, at a dance, 6'2", easy, right? They fall in love, opposites. They fall in love, they get married. She comes from a very rich family with a lot of slaves and a big plantation. He, being charitable, maybe had a 6th grade education, but he read wildly. He was a self-taught lawyer. In those days, you could become a professional just by joining with somebody, like you hung out your sign that you're a lawyer and you join her and you stay for a couple of years and you read law and that's it. And then you can be a lawyer or a doctor or anybody else. We don't have professional schools yet. So he's a young, struggling lawyer. He's very politically active. He wants to work his way up. They get married. The family's, Mary Todd's wedding gift from her family is a dozen slaves. Because they're a slave-owning family. What else do you give a new bride, right, to establish her household? He, Lincoln, was appalled. What? No way. So you see this thing, Lincoln was a slave owner. No, he was not a slave owner. They were his wives. They were given as a wedding gift, and within a month or two, he just sent them back. He never was a slave owner. So they established their home, and she is a social butterfly. She loves people. It's wonderful. She helps his career going forward. It's terrific. He gets elected to Congress for 1 term. He only serves then. He comes back. Then he runs for senator in 1858 against Stephen Douglas. He loses, which is good, because in 1860 he becomes our first Republican, capital R, first Republican president. Republican Party has only been founded 6 years ago, 1854, as a unifier of the Whigs, the Know Nothings, the American, all different kinds of parties going together, the Unionists, and it becomes that. So, hooray, she's going to go to Washington. Wonderful. But Lincoln, as we understand, as we know, tragically, is a minority president. He got 0 votes from any state in the South. And you will be interested to know, he never got any votes from New Jersey either. New Jersey in those days was a strongly Democratic, pro-Southern state. We had slaves in this state until 1860, the start almost of the Civil War, despite the fact that after 1808, importation was prohibited and there were all kinds of local abolition laws that never really took place. In any case, so Mary marries Abraham. They go to Washington, D.C. It's a fraught journey. He is smuggled into Baltimore because Baltimore is in Maryland. That's a southern, has a lot of slaves. They're very upset with that. They cover the windows of the railroad train. They have secret service. They have, army people lining the thing. He gets smuggled into Washington in the dead of night. His inauguration is practically held in secret. He gets sworn in, and Mary becomes the first lady. Within a very short time, the first southern states secede. South Carolina walks out of the Union, and then the other southern states follow. And Lincoln is now not only a minority president, never having won a huge amount of votes in the popular vote, but he is also a sectional president only of the northern states, and the Civil War breaks out. And why is this important to Mary? Because her family are still slaveholders in Kentucky, and she's married to a man who was the head commander-in-chief of the Union Army that's killing her brothers and her family and her fathers and all her cousins and everybody else down there. So imagine, every time there's a Union victory, it's, what about my family? Is my brother still alive? Is my father? Did my home get burned down? So you talk about marital problems? I mean, this was really, really bad. They have 4 children, all sons. How many survived? What? One dies almost before they get into the White House. Another one dies while they are in the White House, and another one after. The only one that survives is Robert Lincoln, who, believe it or not, does live a very long time into the 20th century. So, Mary, the Civil War is raging. Union casualties flood into the nation, into the capital. They set up ad hoc hospitals and rehab homes and everything else. She wants to redeem herself. The fact, it's well known that she's a Southern slave owner type lady. And so she becomes a nurse, or passed for a nurse then. She works in the hospitals that are set up for the Union soldiers. And one of the people that helps her is a man whose name you also know, Walt Whitman. Leaves the Grass, poet, American literary scholar. Walt Whitman is, of course, homosexual. But at the time, the word does not exist. Nobody recognizes it, but the two of them become friends because they're both helping the wounded recover in the hospitals. But Mary's lost children. Her family may be killed. Her plantation home, the one that she loved, that she came from as a young child, a young bride, may be burned to the ground. The South eventually is losing. She is very upset. And so she indulges in what we now call retail therapy. She gets on a train. There are trains now at Union Station in Washington, D.C. And she takes the train to New York City. And she goes to a newly established store that sells all kinds of pretty nice things. And the store, named for a French immigrant a couple of dozen years ago, called Tiffany. And, right, Tiffany's, the same reputation it has now. So Mary Todd Lincoln takes the train, goes to New York, goes to Tiffany, and shops. And boy, does she shop. In 1 year, $26,000. Now that's gold dollars, folks. That's not Federal Reserve greenbacks. That's going to come later. Now, you could probably go on Google and figure out how much it is now, I assume. But in 1 year, $26,000. Now, women in those days wore calfskin gloves, right? And they got soiled. So what did you do with them? You threw them out. So she buys dozens and dozens of pairs of gloves. And she loves jewelry, earrings, and headbands, and necklaces, and gowns, because there's Bonwit Teller, there's all these wonderful stores. And she comes back with trunks full, railroad carriages full of clothing at the same time that Lincoln is scrounging for ammunition for the Union Army. And he's not earning enough. Nowhere close he gets $26,000 a year in those days. So she runs up bill after bill after bill. Why do they keep extending credit to her? Because she's the president's wife. You know, you're going to say, no credit cards. You can write me a check. No, we don't have checks. Open your purse and give me, no. She's Mary Todd Lincoln. Of course you can have whatever you want. 20 dozen pair of gloves? By all means. 10 pairs of shoes? Of course, my lady. Gown, everything. She brings them back to the White House. But where does she wear them? Entertainment has stopped for the war. There are no more balls. There's no more fancy things, dinners and things that had been established all this time. So they hang in the closet and they stay folded. And that's how we know what they are, because eventually they will go to the Smithsonian, right, which is established about the same time. And we find them still in the original packaging. That's how we know how big she was and everything else. Some of them are still there. You can go to the Smithsonian. One of the parts of the Smithsonian Museum of American History is the President's Wing, and there's a whole section devoted to the First Ladies, and you can see some of the stuff that she wore and that she had. So what did Lincoln say about this? He's busy running a war. He wants to keep his wife happy. Yes, the war is over. Celebrate. I can wear my fancy stuff. Let's go to theater. And we know how that ends. The gown that she wore that night when he was assassinated, technically we think we still have pieces of it. I'm not too sure. I read several different things about it. In any case, his brains are blown out because the one guard assigned to the door gets drunk and falls asleep. Lincoln is assassinated. He dies the following morning. Mary goes rather insane. Her husband was assassinated right next to her. And she gets, her son, her only living son, Robert, has her committed to an insane asylum because he says she's insane. And she stays there for several years. Eventually, she is released and she lives out her life in misery and, I suppose, genteel poverty in Chicago with her sister. What happens to her family in Kentucky? Their plantation is destroyed. Several of the brothers and the men are killed. They are never again rich. It's the same typical story of what happens all there. So Mary Todd Lincoln has come down to us as a insane, spendthrift woman who was not terribly supportive of her husband. She was probably not the right person to be the president's wife in time of war, but you can't pick and choose. That's what happened. She certainly had no preparation for the role that she was expected to play. And that's, well, how would our history have been different if she had been a different person? But she wasn't. Theodore Roosevelt, everybody's favorite. Teddy, right? Teddy's born in New York. Family goes back to the Dutch, 1600s. He is born as a sickly young child. He has asthma, which they don't recognize at the time. And his father, by sheer force of will and everything else, he gets himself better. He's only about 5'8", 5'9", becomes an athlete, educated at home, goes to Harvard. His Harvard roommate, Charles Lee, says, my sister, first days and when you first move into a dorm, everybody's family piles in. So the sister of his roommate walks in, and she is this gorgeous, evidently, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, bouncy curl, gorgeous creature called Alice Lee. And Teddy turns around from whatever he's doing, and the roommate introduces him, and Teddy says, "I'm going to marry you," which is typical Teddy. Just actually, what? What? And he's from New York, so Boston people, they talk only to God. He's nothing. So yes, it does happen. He graduates in 4 years. They do get married. They go to New York City. They live there. Teddy's mother, Martha Bullock, Bulloch, was a Georgia belle, raised in very similar circumstances to Mary Todd, although no slaves at that point. A dainty little fragile type woman who adored her family, made friends with everybody and everything else. So his widowed mother, and they have a house, a townhouse on West 28th Street in Manhattan, brownstone. You can still see it. It's a National Historic Site. So Teddy brings his China doll wife, Alice Lee, back, and Teddy has become police commissioner. He's now also moves up to the New York State legislature, where he is a first-year assemblyman. And she becomes pregnant. Alice Lee becomes pregnant almost immediately. Teddy is in Albany. He gets a telegram, "Come back." So he gets on the train. He comes back. He walks into the house, and everybody is hysterical crying. Why? Because Alice Lee has died, giving birth to their first child, a daughter, who was also named Alice Lee. I don't know why people do that, but they do. Named Alice Lee. And upstairs, his wife is dying, and downstairs, his mother dies on the same day. So you have the wife and the mother dying on the same day. And he's left with a little baby girl. And men don't do parenting and fathering in those days. He is beside himself with grief. He cannot even bear to say the child's name because it's the same name as the woman that he's loved since he was a freshman in college. He leaves. He runs away. Where does he go? Go west, young man. He goes to the Dakota Territories. But before he goes there, he places an order with Brooks Brothers. So he has all his buckskin. Yeah, he wears buckskin and his cowboy stuff, all made by Brooks Brothers. All his life he had bespoke clothes. Goes there, buys himself a ranch, runs cattle, becomes very well known in the territory, goes into law enforcement, isn't the sheriff, but has sort of the duties of the sheriff. He arrests the bad guys, he captures criminals, he solves a murder, he becomes friends with the Indians, which is rare at the time. He hires them. There are all kinds of black people looking around for jobs because slavery is over now, so they go west too. So he hires blacks as cowboys and friends, and this whole mix of people become his supporters and his friends. And then the horrible, terrible blizzard of 1888 hits, and everybody is wiped out. The snowdrifts are bigger, higher than this building. He loses all his cattle. It's time. His family, he misses the family back east. They call him home. "Come on, Teddy, come home. Surely you're okay now." He goes back home, and Alice is now, 4 or 5 years old, 4 or 5, 6 years old. She's a young lady. He still finds it hard to say her name, but all of a sudden he's a father to this young girl that he doesn't know. And who has raised her? His sister, Corinne Bama, and the next door neighbor that he's known forever. Her name is Edith Kermit, Kermit, which you probably should know from Sesame Street, right? And he has known her all this time, but he's not been aware of how she is. And Alice Lee, the little girl, thinks, she didn't know her real mother because her real mother died at birth, that Edith Kermit is like a mother to her. And so Teddy falls in love with Edith Kermit. And he can't bear the thought of getting married here in the United States because that would be a betrayal, whatever the thing is. So they go to London, they get married in the American ambassador's residence. He calls them back here. And Edith Kermit Roosevelt, second wife, now proceeds to have 6 children. All of them live, right? Which is kind of unusual at that point. And Edith is the perfect wife for Teddy. When people ask her, "How do you manage a household with 6?" She says, "No, there are really 7 children because Teddy's a little boy." And that's it. She performs everything. She's his public face. Their country home is an estate in North Shore of Long Island called Sagamore Hill, which is now an historic site. That's where he's buried. You can see it. It's absolutely magnificent. And Alice, the first the daughter from the first wife, has grown up into a rather obstreperous teenager, maybe because whatever, we don't really know, but she does things that are unbelievable for the time. Edith's first child, by the way, was a daughter, and then she had sons after that. There was Ethel, and then there's Archibald, Quentin, Kermit, Roosevelt, Teddy Jr., I forget the other one. So you have all these kids running around, and Teddy adores animals. So the White House becomes like a menagerie. There's horses and lizards and dogs and cats and monkeys and parrots. And ambassadors know that when they come, they bring presents. Not to Teddy, they bring to the kids. So it's a real mishmash sort of thing. And Alice, now that he's become president, it's 1901, 1908. It's modern times, the 20th century. And Alice takes full advantage of it. She smokes. See, we have cigarettes now in public. She wears trousers. Spare me. She's photographed driving a car alone and riding horseback, side like this. Not side saddle, the way well brought up young ladies did, but wearing trousers. Jodhpurs is the actual term for it, right? And she is out late, and she's not escorted. She's photographed cameras in a private party with a champagne glass in her hand. She's drinking in public, and she's a teenager. At one point, the French ambassador is visiting President Roosevelt, diplomatic reception, and Alice comes rampaging into the room with a whole retinue of things, and she's wearing her riding outfit and then kisses him and runs out. And the French ambassador looks at Teddy and says, "Can't you control your daughter?" And Teddy says, "I can be president of the United States, or I can be Alice's father. I cannot be both." And that's exactly what happens. Alice makes a disastrous marriage to Nicholas Longworth, who was the then Speaker of the House. That's when we had Speakers of the House. He's a Republican. It's a miserable sort of marriage. She married just to get married. She has a long love affair with a Nebraska senator called Bora, who is 20 years older than she is. She has a child with him that she passes off as Nicholas Longworth's child, Pauline, who will also have a miserable, in any case. So, and Alice lives until John Kennedy becomes president, and she rides in his inaugural parade in a car. And when she is assigned, this is your car, this is you're going to go in, and she's, God knows, in her 80s or 90s at that point, and she says, "Why can't I drive it?" That's Alice. Edith Kermit Roosevelt, the second wife, was a wonderful, steadying influence on Teddy. Everyone adored her. She was a marvelous, marvelous human being. And one of the things she does in the White House is to encourage arts. At the time, it was not such a role that women did, but she was very interested in writing and literary authors. And she used to hold readings, book clubs, book sort of things. She was one of the first to do something like that. And she established the principle that every book that was published in the United States, a copy goes to the White House. I don't know if you know that, but that's true. Now, obviously, you can't do that now because the building is way too small. So it goes now to the Library of Congress, and the little bookplate on the inside says, "Donated by courtesy of the President and Mrs. whomever it happens to be." And that's one of the ways that the Library of Congress is enriched with that. So she has book clubs and literary things, and everybody adores her. Teddy dies of a heart attack in 1919, having lived 20 different lives. And Edith becomes a widow and withdraws from public life. Their sons all fought in World War I. Quentin, that's the other one. Quentin gets killed. He's flying for the French Air Force. Teddy Jr. stays in the military, and in World War II, he will be part of the invasion at D-Day, Normandy. And as he lands from those landing craft things and runs up the beach, two stories. Either he falls down or a German bullet hits him, whatever it is. In any case, he falls down, breaks his ankle. Being Teddy's son, he doesn't let that stop him. He manufacture whatever crutches he can, and he continues fighting with a broken ankle right through the thing. It's a fascinating story, and she is just such an amazing lady to realize that she goes into this difficult situation, second marriage, and makes just the world of herself. I sort of skipped over Frances Cleveland. I'll just tell you a little bit about her. Cleveland was the only Democratic president from the Republicans, from Lincoln until Wilson. And she's the ward of a very rich lawyer called Grover Cleveland, right? Grover Cleveland in upstate New York. And because she's a ward, he has contact with her family and everything else. And he keeps visiting and talking and everything. And Frances Cleveland's mother thinks that Grover Cleveland is there because he's interested in her and courting her. And one night he comes and he hauls out a Tiffany ring box, because that's all that people used in those days. And the mother says, he's going to propose to me. And they go into the parlor and he looks at her and he says, I would like your daughter's hand in marriage. So 50-odd-year-old Grover Cleveland, who already has an illegitimate child that people know about. Grover, where's your pa? Went to Washington, ha, 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 that sort of thing. Marries 19-year-old Frances Cleveland, right? And she, who knows what love is? She marries him. He's 30 years her senior. They have 4 children. The first child they have, born in the White House, is a beautiful baby girl. You could not imagine how gorgeous this child is. Absolutely exquisite. And we have photography now, so there are pictures all over. And look at this pretty child, and she's so cute and adorable. And we call her, she's so sweet. And we have a French immigrant who has started a candy making business, and he gloms onto this and he names one of his candy bars after her because she is so cute. And that candy bar comes to be called Baby Ruth, because that's the name of the child. Not Babe Ruth. No, that's wrong. It's Baby Ruth, because Baby Ruth, the first child of Frances and Grover Cleveland, is this gorgeous creature whose name is all over the place. And she's decked out in these fancy bonnets and ribbons and everything else. And she dies at age 12. Yes, that's what happens. She dies at age 12. Woodrow Wilson, elected in 1912. The first PhD president, Princeton, right down the road. A scholar, marries well, English teacher. They have 3 daughters. Fine. He becomes governor of New Jersey, right? Reformer governor, terrific. Rising Republican star. Gets elected as president of the United States in 1912 because there is a split in the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt is leading the Bull Moose Party, and Taft, his anointed successor, is leading the traditional Republican Party. They both lose because that's what happens when you have 3 parties, and Woodrow Wilson becomes president in 1912. And Wilson moves into the White House, at which point his first wife becomes deathly ill. Probably because Washington was still a swamp. And she might have been bitten, we think, by malarial or whatever kind of things it was. She goes in there. She doesn't live very long. She dies. She was perfectly healthy when she was a governor's wife. She goes there. She dies within a couple of years. Wilson is bereft. He loves being pampered, and his wife has done this, and he has 3 daughters, and they all make much of him and everything else. So he really wants to get married again, but he's already president. So how do you fix him up? So people kind of say, we'll meet this one, go to a party, go this. And he gets introduced to the widow of a Washington jeweler who has had, being charitable, a 3rd-grade education. She is a clothes horse, a jewelry wearer, never met a jeweler she didn't like, and probably has an IQ of my shoe size. But he has an instant attraction to her. He asks her to marry him 3 times. Twice, she refuses. The 3rd time, she says yes. He's worn her down. So there is a wedding in the White House, and Wilson has a 2nd wife. The 3 daughters are now grown, and it's World War I. The war breaks out. Wilson is an older man at this point, although in his 60s. The war pressure wears him down tremendously. He is the second president to leave the United States when the war is over. He goes to Europe to the Versailles Peace Conference. First president is Teddy Roosevelt, of course. Goes to Europe, comes back with the 14 points and the League of Nations Charter. The war to end all wars. All the nations will join together. We will talk. We will not have wars anymore. Clemenceau's, the French prime minister's comment is, of course, the most important one. After Wilson presents them with the 14 points that this will solve the world's peace forever and ever, Clemenceau says, God only had 10. So that's typical of Wilson. He comes back, he's exhausted. He faces a Republican Congress, specifically a Senate, dominated by a man called Henry Cabot Lodge, whose ancestry goes back to the 1600s. And Lodge and Wilson are bitter enemies for a whole variety of reasons that we're not going to go into here because this is not American political course, but they hate each other. And Lodge is determined that whatever Wilson wants, he is against. And he offers, trying to be almost reasonable, can you accept a few amendments, a few changes, a few this, a few that, a few the other in the League of Nations, in the 14 points. Let's try and meet some sort of compromise. Wilson, the son of a Presbyterian minister who was always right because that's what the women around him always told him, and who has a Messiah complex that I have saved the world when the United States entered World War I because we won it, for Europe says, no, my way or the highway. And Wilson embarks on a railroad tour of the United States, speaking from the backs of railroad cars in the open, any place, little towns, whatever. Railroads were the big thing in those days. And he stops all across the United States. He's getting older and sicker and more exhausted. Very little medical care at that point. At one of the towns, he starts to open his mouth to give the speech. Write to your congressman, write to your senator, support me. This is the war to end all wars. The United States won the war. And he can't speak. He freezes. Silence. Have you seen some video of Mitch McConnell? The same sort of thing. He probably, again, medical care in the 19 teens, he probably had the first in a mini series of strokes, not necessarily diagnosed. And as he starts to get up to speak, and he can't speak, he turns around, we think maybe to ask us, whatever it does, and he kind of trips, has a stroke, whatever, and falls down. The press in those days was easily cowed, or whatever it was, and so they didn't publish this. There were no photographs of it, but that's what happens. His wife, who was with him, can't continue, obviously. He's sick, he's had a stroke, he's semi-paralyzed. They go back to Washington, D.C. Wilson is now ensconced in the presidential bedroom on the second floor, and no one sees him. For the next year and a half, he is kept in isolation by his wife. Have we had a female president? Yes. Mrs. Wilson II keeps him totally isolated. She and the doctor are the only people that see him. Not the vice president, not the Speaker of the House, not the Senate president. Nobody is permitted in. And what does she say? To assume, to let people go off from this. He's not feeling well. He's sleeping. He's resting. He had a cough. He can't talk. For a year and a half. But that's what happens. Meanwhile, the government has to go on. So what about all these documents and things that the president is supposed to do? Edith signs them. She forges his signature on dozens, hundreds of documents. And how do we know this? Because we have them and we can see what they are. He can't write. His whole half side is paralyzed. He can barely speak. He does recover a little bit. He can recognize, at some point towards the end, he begins to start feeding himself. But he certainly can't walk, and he can't write, and he can't speak. And this is an orator of the ages, right? So yes, Edith Wilson runs the government for the last year and a half. And Harding is elected in 1920. And The tradition, except for John Adams, was that the outgoing president rides right with the incoming president. So what are you going to do with Wilson? So he's carried down the back stairs so nobody sees him. He's put into the car. His legs are bent. He's wrapped. It's March. He's wrapped up in all these blankets and buffalo robes and a big hat put on his head. And you can hardly see his face in the pictures because he can barely sit up and he certainly can't speak. And she's next to him wrapped in her minks and furs, smiling. Hello, how is everything? And obviously, he's not going to stand on the podium, so they say it's too cold for him to get out of the car. After the inauguration, Wilson and his wife go back to a townhome in Washington, D.C., National Historic Site. You can visit it, you can see it. He lives for 3 more years. He doesn't die until 1923. He does recover some functions. He eventually is able to stand and to speak, but haltingly, slurring some of his words and not always remembering his words. She is fiercely protective of him. No press conferences, no dinner parties, no anyone she doesn't know is not permitted in. Old friends can come and they can have dinners and, whatever with him, but certainly nothing else. How would history have been different, among other things, if he had not had the stroke, if he had been willing to compromise with Lodge on some things, if he hadn't had Edith to take over? Supposing she had been a wife like Abigail, educated and able to run or told people about her or whatever. There was no Succession Act. He would have had to have resigned the presidency or left, and the vice president would have taken over, which would have been a pretty bad thing also. In any case, so that's Edith Wilson. Are you still okay with me? You're fine? Yes. You're doing this? Okay. I know we have 42 of them, and I'm only doing a few. Yes, question.
Was there anything that she signed like detrimental to the government or?
Are you a Republican or a Democrat? It was his Democratic agenda that they almost got through almost all of it. Remember, it's after the war, so we're rebuilding. There's a lot of appropriation bills that have to get passed then, same as now. She signed them. She signed appointments, commissions, every commissioned officer in the military, judges. That's all presidential stuff. Receiving ambassadors.
Did she like speak to Wilson and say, I have this to sign, and she just did it on her own without even?
As far as we know, she never consulted him. She kept him as isolated and as quiet and calm as possible. She was afraid, I guess, he would die, maybe. I mean, we're talking 1919, strokes, medical care.
Show on at the play Berkeley about the 2 Wilsons, which was very interesting.
Yeah, and we'll never really know what happened between the 2 of them in the bedroom. But as far as we know, she never consulted him. The doctor was the only visitor that was ever permitted in. She never even told the vice president. And the cabinet never met for a year and a half. So all I do is report the facts that this went on. How people permit, who knows? But that's what happened, and it went on. So yeah, she ran the government. Appointments, appropriations, signatures of bills, Congress. Yes, it was there. Not publicly, obviously, but yes, that's exactly what she did. That was a great question. I have to mention Helen Taft, just briefly. Helen Taft was the wife of William Howard Taft, who was Teddy's chosen successor. 1 term, 1908 to 1912. Everybody loved Helen. Prior to the presidency, he had been ambassador to the Philippines and Governor General of the Philippines. And while she was there, because she was a brilliant woman, she taught herself Chinese and Tagalog and Japanese and everything else. So they tour the Far East, and everybody falls in love with her. And she goes to Japan, and she loves the Japanese culture. And Helen, what can we give? We love you. We want to give you a gift, right? What can we give you? Well, they're rich. What do we give them? So the Japanese, in their infinite wisdom, give Helen Taft cherry trees. And they take the cherry trees back. And when he is president, she causes them to be planted around the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. And the reason we have cherry trees, thank you, Helen Taft. And now there are all different kinds of species and everything else. they're alien and you shouldn't really plant them because birds and pollinators don't like them. They look pretty, but they're useless. But every cherry tree you see in the spring, when you see the gorgeous pink and white blossoms, and they're all over the festivals, right? Cherry tree queens and princesses and parades and things like that, a sign of spring, say, thank you, Helen Taft. That's what she did as she was president's wife. The other thing she did, for which she gets absolutely zero credit, is that she is completely responsible for the building of the Supreme Court building, the actual physical building. Up until Helen Taft, the Supreme Court met in the basement of the Capitol in a room with no windows that was the old Senate chamber. And yeah, it was nice. It was decorated, painted, but yeah, she hated it. And she wanted William Howard to be Chief Justice of the United States, which is really what he was far better at than president. He never liked being president. So Harding appoints, when Harding was president in 1920, Harding appoints Taft. There's a vacancy to the Supreme Court, and Helen says, this is intolerable, meeting in the basement, I will not stand for this. And because she's Helen Taft, gets the Senate to appropriate $20 million, gold dollars, still, to build a special building all for the Supreme Court. It takes 10 years to build. It's gorgeous. You've all seen pictures of it, the pillars and everything, the frieze and all the justices and everything there. And the Supreme Court finally has a place to meet, and William Howard Taft dies. He never gets to be in it, and Helen is crushed. But if you go into the Supreme Court building and tour it, and you still can, there's a plaque on the wall on the left-hand side when you go down, and it says, this building courtesy of, and it has a little story about Helen Taft. So cherry trees and the Supreme Court building. I like the cherry trees better, but in any case. Okay, so you want to know about Florence Harding? No, you don't. Florence Harding had an illegitimate child when she was 17. She was a rich banker's daughter and only child. She marries Warren to get out of Ohio because she hates Ohio. She wants to be a big society lady, and she thinks he's going to be a big national person, which he is. In 1920, he was considered the handsomest man in America. I don't see it. But women get the first vote then, and so they elect him, and he becomes president, and it's prohibition and everything else. But Harding, who was one of our worst presidents, drinks in the White House, has gambling, and has a mistress whom he brings into the White House, whom he installs in a walk-in closet. There's a bed, you can see it, it's there. Has a bed and everything else, has an illegitimate child, is touring on the West Coast. You'll know him, of course, from the Teapot Dome. He is touring on the West Coast, and he dies in 1923. So, did his wife poison him, or did he die of food poisoning? Pick your choice. Pick whatever you want to do, right? This one, I know I'm running out of time. This one, we could go on forever. I also have if I'm invited back, I have a special talk just on this lady, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. Roosevelt.
It's going to be a whole day.
It's a whole thing. I hardly know where to begin. Let's just do the first, well, sort of a little bit. Her mother died when she was 8. Her father died when she was 10. She was brought up by her maternal grandparents, who did not like her. She grew to be 6 feet tall. She was, to put it charitably, plain. She had buck teeth, no braces. She had a high-pitched, squeaky voice. Her maternal grandparents called her Granny because you're such an old, ugly thing. They never called her by her first name. When she was 15, she was sent abroad to England to be educated at a private school. The 3 happiest years of her life. She learned fluent French. It was a girls' school. She was valued for whom she was. Her height and everything made no difference to them. She decided she was going to be a teacher because she had such a good time. At 18, her grandparents say, back to New York. You are now a debutante. You have to have a husband, right? She said, no, I want to stay here. I want to go to the école. I want to go to France. I want to be, nope. Girls have no agency. She is hauled back to New York City. She is introduced to society balls, right? Everybody in white, everybody dancing. She's 6 feet tall. Who's going to dance with her, right? She is the epitome of a wallflower. And at one of the dances, a young, handsome, gorgeous man walks in, who's 6'1", and he sees her in the corner. And he walks over to her and he says, I think we're related. And she hardly knows what to say. Really? Who are you? And he says, I'm your cousin, Franklin. And we have the same last name. So they go through this genealogy thing. They're really either fifth or sixth cousins. Figure it out. Their common ancestor was Nicholas Roosevelt, Nicholas, spelled Dutch, who arrived in the 1600s, had two sons. One son lived in the Hudson Valley, became Democrats. Another son lived in Long Island, became Republicans. That's why there are two different branches of the Roosevelt family. How did he knew her because society knew each other in those days. And he says, would you like to dance? And she says, I'd rather not. So they go out on the terrace and they spend the next 17,000 hours talking to each other. And he is enchanted with her mind because she's not this little flibberty thing, this China doll that knows nothing. She speaks French. She knows things. She's been educated. She is a marvelous conversationalist. And they're related. He falls in love with her. And he goes back to his mother, a widowed lady called Sarah Delano, whose ancestors had been here since the 1600s, French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution, goes back to his mother, and he said, debutante balls are a success. I met the girl I'm going to marry, and she's thrilled. That's who? Huh, tell me. And he says, Anna Eleanor Rose. And she says, what? She's totally unsuitable. She has no parents. Her father has committed suicide. Her mother died at the age of 29. She's 6 foot tall. She's like, nothing. This is not why I sent you to debutante balls. And so the mother takes Franklin to Europe, right, to be far away, because they're rich. And they spend a year traveling around Europe, and Franklin and Eleanor write to each other secretly, right? And he comes back, and it hasn't changed his mind. They're going to get married. So they get married on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, in New York City, in a townhome, right on 68th Street. You can still see it. So here is Eleanor, a bride, the center of all attention, right? Totally ignored, shoved off like a wallflower again. Why? Because who's giving her away? Teddy, Uncle Teddy is there. And everybody wants to speak to Teddy. Nobody wants to speak to Eleanor. So they get married and they leave. I mean, nobody cares. There's not, throwing rice and, have a honeymoon and everything else. So he takes her to Europe. And she comes back pregnant, of course. And in the first 11 years of their marriage, she has 6 pregnancies. One child dies at 11 months old, probably diphtheria. 5 living children. 1 girl, the rest are boys. That's what was expected of women in those days. Franklin, meanwhile, has become a rising political star. New York City, state legislature, runs for president in 1920, loses, he and Cox, to Harding, probably a good thing, and goes back to New York to make his way there. During World War I, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which is the job that Teddy had under Wilson. So, it's hot summer in New York City. We have no air conditioning. They have a vacation home, second homes for rich people. The vacation home is an island that's owned jointly by Canada and the United States in the bay north of Maine. It's called Campobello, beautiful campsite in French. So she goes there with the kids in the summer, leaving Franklin in Washington, D.C. in this hot summer, no air conditioning, if you can imagine that, while World War I is raging. And Franklin goes to Europe. He wants to get in on the action. He's too old to be drafted and to be a fighter, but he wants to see what the war is like. He goes in his capacity as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He tours the thing. He comes back, and Eleanor is unpacking for her beloved Franklin. And she discovers a packet of letters tied with a pretty pink ribbon. This isn't my handwriting. I didn't do this. So she unties the ribbon and she slips out one of the letters, and she finds that Franklin has been having an affair with her social secretary, who has become his mistress for the last several years. And every summer, when Eleanor and the kids go to Campobello, Lucy Rutherford Mercer moves in to the townhouse in Washington, D.C. Eleanor is crushed. Franklin is the only person she thinks who has ever loved her in her life. And now she has written evidence of a mistress. When he comes back, he finds at his dinner plate the stack of envelopes. And she sends the children out of the room and she says, I want a divorce. Now, you don't divorce at that social level. It's death. You never do that. She is also has told her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano, who has never really liked her to begin with, I'm divorcing Franklin. And she presents her with evidence. And this is the first and only time probably in the entire relationship that Sarah sticks up for Eleanor. She goes to Franklin and she says, okay, you can have a divorce, but if you do, there will be no more money. There will be nothing. I will cut you out completely from your inheritance. And Franklin caves. Eleanor is persuaded to take him back. He promises in front of his mother and his wife, I will never see Lucy Rutherford Mercer again. It's over. I will be faithful to you forever after. And so to celebrate their reunion, it's summer, they go to Campobello, and Franklin goes swimming in the ice-cold waters, and he doesn't eat very well because he's too busy with everything else, and he sits in the room on the porch in the chill wind in a wet bathing suit and goes to sleep, has a light supper, can't eat much, and wakes up the next morning immobile. He cannot move. He has a case of what is called then infantile paralysis or poliomyelitis. Totally, no one understood it. It has no cure, nobody gets it. And the name, infantile paralysis, because most of the time, 90% of the time, it hit kids. It didn't hit adults. It's hard for us to understand the mental outlook at that time, but it was a shameful thing. It was a child disease, and here is this grown man in his 40s, and he has it. The treatment is, at the time, brutal. The fact that it didn't kill him is amazing. They tried to stretch his legs. They put hot tacks on it. Whatever they did made it even worse. And from the waist down, he is now paralyzed. They have to take him back to New York City because that's where the best medical things are. So they take him at night in a train. And because he is the way he is, they cut the windows out of the train and they carry him, they lift him up on a stretcher and they put him into a sleeping car on the train. But the motion of the train against his body he's screaming in agony. So they shoot him full of morphine to get him back to New York City. They take him to a hospital. Nobody knows how to treat it. Nobody even knows what it is at that point. And that's it. He is now paralyzed. His mother comes to meet him. He's moved back into the townhouse. Mother comes and says, well, your political career is over. That's it. You can't be out in public. It's shameful. Terrible. Can't do that anymore. You will come back to Hyde Park, which is where the family residence is. You will now be what I wanted for you all the time. You will be a gentleman farmer, the way your father and your ancestors and everybody else says. Let's not do any more of this dirty, terrible political work anymore, because she never liked it anyway. And Eleanor looks at him and her mother-in-law, who has never liked her, and says, let's ask Franklin what he wants. And Franklin, in the midst of his agony, and we're quite sure that he was in terrible pain, says, I'd like to do as much as I can with the rest of my life. I don't want to be just a farmer. So the two women that never liked each other to begin with are now even more at odds with each other. But Eleanor, in this case, triumphs, and she takes him back to New York City to the townhouse. And the townhouse, remember they were married there? That was Sarah's wedding gift to them, was adjoining townhouses in New York City. And Sarah cut doors on each floor so that she could go back and forth without having to go outside.
Susan,
Yes,
weren't those townhouses eventually turned over to
Hunter College.
college?
It's now the Hunter College School of Social Work.
The dividing wall out so that
It could be open, right? And there's a plaque on it and you can see it.
Right.
When I was at Hunter, you could walk there and I had a couple of classes there. Yeah, they're exquisite.
they took
Exactly.
care of that.
And oddly, right around the corner used to be the Russian ambassador's Khrushchev,
It's East 65th.
E68.
East 60.
Khrushchev was there when he went to the UN. Remember the shoe pounding incident? That was right around the corner. That was the backyard of the Roosevelt townhouse.
Longer, how many more?
We're only up to Eleanor. I promise I'll go fast after this.
Okay.
You can leave if you want. It's okay. I'm sorry. I know. Okay. You can feel free. Get up if you want to leave. I won't be insulted.
Get some bottles of water.
I'll try to do the rest in 10 minutes. I'll be done by 4. Okay. So Eleanor takes Franklin and becomes a different human being because now, despite the divorce and the threat and the divorce and the misery and everything else, she now has to become his legs. And Franklin he is able at this point to sit up in a chair, a wheelchair. It's a kitchen chair that he divides on himself, just like this, but he has wheels put on it, one of the first. In all the thousands of photographs we have of Franklin, only 2 with the wheelchair. Because the press, courteously in those days, never published anything like that. And Eleanor has to become a political wife, which she had 0 training for, and she really didn't want to be. So he becomes governor of New York in 1928. He defeats Al Smith for the nomination. He becomes the Democratic presidential candidate in 1932, and he walks to the podium. He's carrying 20 pounds of steel braces on his legs and holding him as he walks, his son, James, the oldest boy that he has. And you will see lots of photographs of Franklin being, and you think, oh, how affectionate, a father and a son. But that was the only way he could stand up. And he has practiced for months. And they build a mock-up of the podium and the thing, measuring out the steps, 20 steps from where he is. And he holds on to the podium and he delivers his speech and everybody goes crazy and he gets nominated. And of course, we then know he's the only 4-term president. And Eleanor moves into the White House. And what does she do as First Lady? Everything. She sets the paradigm for the modern First Lady. She writes a newspaper column called My Day. She takes no money for it. Every single day she writes this. She writes books. She's active in plays. She invites people to meet him because he can't go out. So she invites people in. And whom does she invite? Black people into the White House. What? Now, the first one that did that was Teddy. He invited Booker T. Washington for lunch and never got over it. He was almost impeached because of that. When there were servants in the White House, up until 1860, they were slaves. Slaves, White House, right? And then 1860, after Lincoln kicked them out and hired white people. And they were Irish immigrants, white Irish immigrants. But when wartime comes, they flood out and you need still people to do this. And the rich people need nannies and servants and everything else. And the white people, I don't mean to offend, I'm just saying, the white people leave, they go into the war jobs, and so you import black people to do this. So Eleanor was among the first to have black servants in her home to help raise the kids as nannies and things like that, and cooks and everything. And she made the acquaintance of black people. And one of the people she got to know very well was a woman called Mary McLeod Bethune from Florida. And Mary McLeod Bethune introduces her to a whole other group of black people. And that sort of becomes the unofficial black cabinet that Roosevelt uses, but you can't have pictures of them because that would be terrible. So you don't have that. So there's black people. And there's all kinds of other artists, everything else. And Eleanor travels all over. And among the things she does is she still wants to teach, but president's wife can't do things like that. So she becomes an American Red Cross nurse. And when World War II breaks out and all 4 of their sons go into the Army and Air Force and fight, unlike some president's children, they go there, and Eleanor tours into an active war zone. She goes to the Pacific and she goes to Europe wearing a Red Cross uniform, not the president's wife. Just treat me like a nurse. But of course she isn't. And she tours the wounded and everything else, and everyone adores her, and she's marvelous. And it's so hard to say all the other things that she does. And then what happens? Franklin has a cerebral hemorrhage in Warm Springs, Georgia, where he has established a foundation for infantile paralysis, because one of the therapies that does work, that does help, is to sit in like a big giant hot tub, warm things, because it supports you in your legs, and he can swim. His upper body is really powerful. He was an athlete, so he can swim, and he likes that, and he's in Warm Springs, Georgia, and he's getting his portrait painted. And he has a cerebral hemorrhage. He says, I have a terrible headache, and he falls on the floor, and he dies. Eleanor is in Washington. She gets called. Come down at once. She takes the train down, and she goes in, and Franklin is on the bed, their marital bed. He's dead, obviously. And she asks, what happened? What was there? And one of the servants that they have there says, well, Miss Lucy was here, and Lucy Rutherford Mercer was in the room with the artist when Franklin died. And who got her there? And who made sure that she was there when Eleanor wasn't? Their daughter, Anna Roosevelt, had been the go-between to get Lucy back into Franklin's life. She felt he needed someone that would be unconditional love, not like demanding Eleanor. There's a whole thing there. So at the moment of Franklin's death, she finds out that her husband's mistress was there as well. So she travels back to Washington, and she holds her last news conference. By the way, she was the first president's wife to hold news conferences, only women reporters, because women reporters weren't admitted to the president's news conference. We've had male reporters. So she starts a women's only reporting thing. And she goes back and she says, boys, the story is over. And she goes back to New York City, where she lives with a family friend, and she's there. And then she gets a phone call from Harry Truman, who is now the new president. And he says, is there anything I can do for you? And she says, no, I'm done. That's it. I'm out of public life. And he says, well, that's really unfortunate, because I just appointed you as United Nations ambassador. And she doesn't turn it down. She goes to the UN. She is responsible for the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed in October of 1949, signed by all the countries, almost all of them. There were only 47 in the UN, then 33 signed it. Several abstained. A couple did not do it. Russia did sign it, believe it or not. And how does she get these people to do it? Well, she's a grandmother now, right? So she sits there. She knows French, remember, which is the international language, and she knits. She knits for her and ambassador, you have a grandson? Let me knit him a sweater. Let me, and so she's the knitting grandmother while all this is going on, and she gets everybody to agree to that. And then she says, that's it, I'm done, I'm out. Well, we have an ambassadorship open in India. And then, and she becomes the first lady of the world. And everywhere she goes, she's a rock star. She's Taylor Swift beyond imagination, without singing, because she's Eleanor Roosevelt. At some point, she had an automobile accident, that's another thing, which knocked her teeth in, so her voice got better. She becomes a power in the Democratic Party. And any candidate has to go to her to get interviewed and to get a blessing, which is going to be an issue when John F. Kennedy wants to be the Democratic candidate in 1960. And she's supported, by the way, remember Adlai Stevenson, who ran against Eisenhower and lost twice? So he was a single widower, and she's single. So there used to be a thing that they were to get married. That never happened. But in any case, so John Kennedy goes to get her blessing because he wants to be the Democratic nominee. And some old prejudices rear their heads. He's Catholic. It's strange for us to think of that, but remember the opposition that John Kennedy had to overcome? He said to the ministers' meeting in Houston in Texas, I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party candidate for president who happens to be Catholic. And as the Pope doesn't speak for me, I do not speak for them. And there were all these things about secret tunnels down to the Vatican, the whole thing. So in any case, he makes nice with her. She blesses him because Adlai Stevenson is out of the picture now, and John Kennedy, with her support, she campaigns for him, and she's in his inaugural parade, becomes president of the United States, the first president. So, and then she goes on and on. Eleanor is buried at Hyde Park next to Franklin, a simple white square of marble from Vermont, with just their names and their birth dates on it. And her story is unending. If you invite me back, I will do a thing. So in any case, Eleanor, so I'll go quickly. Bess Truman hated Washington. She was almost never there. Mamie Eisenhower married Dwight when he was a young lieutenant in Texas. They had 2 children, one of whom dies. She becomes an alcoholic. He goes to Europe. He has a mistress, his GI driver, Kay Summersby, because women did roles that men used to do, becomes his mistress. Does Mamie know? Maybe, maybe not. They come back to Washington, D.C. She campaigns for him. You remember Mamie with the little curly bangs and the pink thing and everything. So they get a house in Gettysburg for the first time, and I told you about that. That was the first house they ever had. Mamie adored parties and loved people around her, and she made Eisenhower as very much a popular president because of that. Jacqueline Kennedy. So a whole other story. Jackie brought the nation into the White House. Remember her television thing? She comes into the White House and she finds it's a disaster because nobody's kept it up. When every president left, they took whatever they wanted with them. They furnished it by themselves. There was no anything for it. So Jackie establishes the White House Historical Association, private organization that starts to buy up, if it can locate them, original pieces of furniture from all the past presidents, redecorates, repaints. She does this wonderful, it's only in black and white, but it's still gorgeous to see it. And in her breathy voice, this is the Blue Room and the State Room, and she brings it back to what it was at the time of Jefferson, which is Federalist, which is French. And that's the way it's been kept up now. The White House that you see today is Jackie Kennedy. And she reestablishes the Rose Garden, and roses are named for her and everything. And she also invites evenings at the White House. Pablo Casals comes to play, and there's ballet dancing and Baryshnikov and plays and stuff. That's Jackie Kennedy. And John's wonderful line when they go to Paris, at a time of heightened tension, it's Algeria, and he announces to the press, the assembled press, I would like to introduce myself. I am the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris. And she why? Because she speaks French, right? She was educated there, so she speaks French to de Gaulle, and he gives Kennedy whatever he wants. So that's her. Lyndon Johnson, his wife, he was very tall, also she was very short. Claudia Alta Taylor, nobody knows her as that. It's Lady Bird. Why? Because when she was born and she was put into her mother's arms, the black nurse that was there said, oh, look at her. She's as pretty as a ladybird. And that's it. She was a ladybird thereafter. Her mother dies when she's, I think, 4 or 5 years old. The father can't afford childcare, so he takes her with him. And she learns on the road with him. He's an insurance salesman sort of thing. And she becomes a brilliant businesswoman. And she's a secretary in her father's business. Lyndon walks in. He's a poor nothing from nothing. And he walks in and he looks down at her and he says, what's your name, lady? And she says who she is. And he says, I'm going to marry you. Just like that. She doesn't know his name. 7 weeks later, they're married.
Oh my God.
That's it. They have 2 daughters. And her business acumen funded his politics. Liquor, real estate, early investments in oil and gas wells, transportation. She could have been CEO. She should have been the head of the Federal Reserve if they did it at that time. She was absolutely brilliant. On the other hand, while she was doing all of this, he had a whole string of mistresses. He goes off to the Navy in World War II because it's important for a president to have a naval career. And while he is there, story, no proof, just saying, he has either a Japanese or a Korean mistress, and they have a child. I don't know that that's factual. I'm just saying it because you'll sometimes see it. So he comes back, he becomes president, continues with the mistresses and everything else, and she funds him and everything else. What does she do that's important? Do you see billboards on highways anymore?
No.
Thank you, Lady Bird Johnson. Beautification of America, planting wildflowers, restoring the national forests, doing all the wonderful things that we take for granted now. No billboards, no advertising, things of that sort. And encouraging conservation because she grew up when it was Roosevelt, New Deal, Civilian Conservation Corps, and all that kind of stuff. It is interesting that she gets very little credit, and yet she was one of the ones that established the tradition also, along with the Roosevelts, but that was a whole different thing, of presidential libraries. If you go to Austin, Texas, you'll see the Lyndon B. Johnson Library, which is a gigantic marble pile. It's huge. And all the records and everything are there. It's absolutely wonderful. And then the tradition always is that presidents leave a legacy of a presidential library someplace that has all the records and everything else, which is what the picture is about. That's the dedication of the Reagan Library, which you have there. Okay? So you have a couple of others which are interesting. Betty Ford, remember? Ford was the first one to say on either privately, publicly, on television, I would expect my daughters to have premarital sex. I would expect my family to smoke marijuana. I mean, you didn't do this then, but she did. She'd been a dancer for Martha Graham. She was a very athletic champion type swimmer, competitive swimmer. Unfortunately addicted to painkillers and alcohol and confessed it. And she and Happy Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller was vice president under Ford, remember that? Came out at the same time publicly saying they had breast cancer. And that was, the word didn't even exist in public and saying it. And so they announced that they had this, they talked about it, and that's why we have October as Breast Cancer Awareness Month and all the pink ribbons and everything else. And Betty Ford founded a clinic in California so people could go, people who were addicted could go there and get care. So she was very much into mental health and everything else that was very important. Rosalind Carter is still alive. She has dementia, Alzheimer's now, married over 70 odd years. When Jimmy was in the Navy and was stationed in Panama and their family started dying, she was the one that ran the plantation. And we say peanut farmer, but that's big business. It's a lot of money involved in that. I have been to Plains, Georgia. It's nothing. It's 2 streets, 1 traffic light. And they live in the same house that they've lived in forever. And where's Mr. Jimmy? Where's Miss, Rosalind? And up until very recently, he still taught Bible school as she did. And she joined him with Habitat for Humanity and doing all kinds of other things. Pretty impressive. A couple of others. Where do we go? Hillary Rodham Clinton. You don't want to hear about her, do you? Laura Bush. Michelle Robinson Obama. Okay, so he's a new graduate of Harvard, right? And Yale. They're both there. He goes to Chicago because that's where they sent him as a new lawyer, get a job. She's in a high-powered law firm. He's a community organizer. He goes in to be interviewed by her to get a job. They sit across the desk. He looks at her and he says, "What are you doing tonight?" Who? And he's got this funny name, Barack. Oh, is he Irish? And there's this black man sitting in front of her. So she says, "I don't even know you." And he says, "We'll get to know each other over dinner." So they date. It's a whirlwind romance. How does she know she's going to marry him? She has a brother, one single brother, and she says to her brother, they're very sports-minded, take him out on the basketball court, play basketball with him, see how well he, true story, see how well he plays. So the brother takes him out on the basketball court, and they play a game of pickup basketball, and Barack loses, the brother wins, and the brother comes back and says, "He's a really good player, you should marry him." And that's how it happened. So they got married. So why do I love Michelle? Michelle was attended the first integrated high school in Chicago, which at the time was a very segregated city. And she's brilliant. She took AP, advanced placement courses. She got 5 in every one of them. I love her. Legend has it that it is possible that some of her ancestors, no proof, hypothetical quotes in italics, were the slaves that helped to build the White House. No proof. Just possible, okay? Because it was Irish immigrant Masons and slaves that built it. So, okay. So Michelle Gum becomes First Lady and moves into the White House and let's move America, right? And she plants a vegetable garden instead of, society. Not roses, not flower, vegetables? Yes. And healthy school food and all this other kind of stuff. And again, very important with culture and art, and they start traditions of going on date nights, right? And days of service. On Martin Luther King Day and other days, they go to soup kitchens and all this other kind of stuff, and they do all of that. So Michelle, and she is still alive, of course, and has written books and everything else. Kind of fascinating story. She is, of course, a graduate of Princeton and Harvard, as many all were. It is interesting when we come to Melania Trump.
Destroy the real story.
She was born in Slovenia, which is a tiny sliver of a nation that you cannot find on a map, I guarantee you. It's a remnant of what used to be the old Yugoslavia. 2.5 million people, about the size of Brooklyn. Her father was a communist. He was the Communist Party leader and worked in an automobile factory when communism was the thing. Her mother worked in a fabric factory. The father had a relationship before married the mother. He has an illegitimate son that Melania has never met. I have no idea what happened to the boy. He's probably still there. They get married. They have 2 daughters. Melania turns out gorgeous and starts modeling at 6 and becomes, as you know, a major European fashion model. Allegedly speaks 5 languages, probably does. Goes to Paris, drops out of school at 16, comes to New York on a work permit legally, becomes a major model here. She's almost 6 feet tall. She's absolutely gorgeous, and meets Donald at a big party. He is already married to the second wife, to Marla Maples, right? They start an affair. She says, I won't have anything to do with you unless you divorce. They do divorce. They get married at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. And among the honored guests at the wedding table are Hillary and Bill Clinton, because there's a photograph of all of them there. And then Donald goes off and becomes real estate and rich and becomes president and everything else. Melania is one of the single most private people you will ever want to meet in your life. Personal story. Their son, they have 1 child, Barron, 2 R's, went to the private school in Manhattan where I taught, Columbia Preparatory and Grammar School. He was in 5th grade, 5th and 6th when I was there. I was in the high school. So I had very little contact. I mean, I saw him in the halls, that kind of stuff, but he was just a kid. He was a 5th grade boy, terrible 5th grade boy, the way all 5th grade boys are terrible. So I had very little contact with him. The story was that he was not terribly bright academically, but he was very rich and could pay the tuition, and so that's why he was there. And that's my story about Barron Trump. When Trump gets to be president, it's like, November is the election and the inauguration isn't until January, and Melania refuses to go to Washington. She stays in New York City. This I know. She stays until Barron finishes the school year. And she does something which I think is really nice. She rents a bus. And she takes the entire class, the whole 5th grade, to Washington, D.C., and puts them up, and they have a tour, and they have parties and pizzas, and who knows what else. And she has this big, wonderful thing for them. And then they go all back, and Barron stays with them. And he goes on to St. Andrews. Now he's in Oakmont Palm School in Florida. He's 17. She has hired a number of private, I know this because I know the teachers. She has hired a number of private tutors for him in a variety of things, both sports and academic. I believe he is graduating from high school this year at 17, and now she's deeply involved in college for him, college things, and getting out. So Melania, who do you want next? Jill Biden. Jill Biden is a Jersey girl. She was born in New Jersey. She was brought up in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. Her father was a banker. She had a good education. She had a college sweetheart. She married him right out of college. That's what kids did in those days. They were married for 2 years. They had no children. Catholic. They got divorced. Several years, she becomes an English teacher. Several years later, she is set up on a blind date by his sons with Joe Biden. He's also Catholic. His wife and first wife and young daughter were killed in an automobile accident. The family thinks he should be married. She knows very little about him. She's a professor. She knows the name. Maybe that's it. So they meet, they court. She doesn't really want to be a political wife, but they fall in love. They get married. Okay, so they have do you know they have a daughter together? Ashley? In their 20s, they have 1 child together, Ashley. Some of the stuff about Jill Biden, she's the first president's wife to work for money. She is a teacher. She teaches adolescent, disturbed type kids. She taught English. She does teach English. PhD, first wife for that. Not that the others weren't smart, but they never finished their degrees. PhD, so she's really Dr. Jill Biden, although when people start calling her that, there is pushback. She's not a real doctor. Doctors are medical doctors, but she's an education doctor, PhD, working for wages. How dare she, as the president's wife? And there is some stuff, some backpedal in the Catholic Church and from others that Joe Biden and Jill should be denied the ceremonial rites of the Catholic Church because her first husband is still alive. She was divorced. And the Catholic Church is, you can't be remarried unless the first one is dead. Okay? So there's this
annulment from the
but
the bishop.
exactly. But so there is some pushback on that, and that's part of the political undercurrent of why some people are, if they need a reason, some people virulently opposed to the Bidens because of the violation of religious norms. I'm just stating, obviously, whatever you believe, and that could be part of it. And therefore, the child they have is illegitimate and shouldn't be recognized and all of that other kind of stuff. And then, of course, there are political positions as well, but that's part of it. You've been wonderful.
It's been great.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Manny Alvarez, a member of the East Brunswick Historical Society, and we're here today after a beautiful program given by Susan Addelston, who spoke about the First Ladies of the United States. A lot of history, some funny things, some not so funny, but real history. She did an excellent job, and we look forward to having similar programs as we do every year. We try to do about 4 to 6 programs of interest to the general public. A lot of times we focus on East Brunswick history, but every once in a while we'll cover things at the national or state level as well. So if sometime along the way you folks listening have a chance to attend one of our programs, do so. You might find it very interesting and entertaining. Thank you.